wouldn't listen.
I don't want to now.
Oh, now you've got to. Please.
All right, if it make you feel any better.
I want to be sure you understand. 1 to 5 they gave me. 1 to 5 years, that is.
It's a long joke.
It's forever. I did 3 months before I came to trial.
It can happen to the best of people.
I'm not the best of people. I'm just Tony Marichek.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Omar Ali Fdal, who is a co-founder and CEO at Statice. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you for the invite, Scott. Great honor to be here and share some of our thoughts about data innovation.
So, Omar, a couple of roles before your current role, you were a research engineer at Amadeus for several years, working on search and data mining. I'm curious as to how that particular experience prepared you for your current role today.
Yeah, exactly. So I started my career in France as a research engineer at Amadeus, one of the major IT providers for the travel industry. My role was the 2010 equivalent of the modern data scientists. I worked with large amounts of data on a daily basis, and within a 10-people team in a 10,000 people company, we launched the first Hadoop cluster of the organization. And soon after that, we created and launched the first pure data product. By pure data product here, I mean that the value was exclusively coming from the insights in the data. As you know, the company business was not really in the data. And that was when I realized that the value of the so-called secondary data use of data and the huge potential of the data economy. So during my daily work, also soon realized that all the rough edges of working with data as a data practitioner of a large enterprise, and already thought that there had to be better ways to process the data. There were a number of issues, locating your data to start with, being sure that you had the rights to access the data, and of course being careful when processing it and while extracting the insights from the data. A couple of years later, I came to Berlin, where I met a couple of brilliant people who had just working on this new technology, which was synthetic data, and they had the ambition of working with data more privacy preserving. And to me, the decision to join was a no-brainer. This is how we started working on Statice.
You know, as I'm listening to your prior experience, I think one of the things that really stands out is the fact that within Amadeus, you and just a handful of people really pioneered and were early adopters of some of the larger scale types of infrastructure as well as processes. And you saw firsthand some of the challenges with working with large data, and things that I think many, let's say, business consumers kind of take for granted in terms of where is it, who's got the rights and permission, and how can we actually access it, and how do we actually pull it in and integrate it, analyze it, and then get results from it, all without having to change the underlying location and the versions that contains that truth. So when we talk about it in the bigger context of this privacy, specifically within Europe, and Europe, of course, has been really at the forefront of privacy regulations like the GDPR, for instance. How are these regulations placing more stringent challenges for enterprises and companies that are right now having to address privacy, but yet they still very much desire to leverage the data that they have to be able to gain insights and decision support.
Yeah, you really touched on the two forces at play here. On the one hand, there are regulations, and before talking about the regulations, I would say that the other global trend is the general public awareness of privacy and expectation of privacy, and the regulations are adjusting to the general public demand. And maybe the main change that arrived with GDPR in particular in Europe is that all data started to be considered as personal data and sensitive data and worthy of the most strict protection. Previously, this was only limited to obviously identifying information such as names, first names, or health data. But right now, this is extended in pretty much all of the privacy regulations all over the world to any sort of personal data. This is the first force. The second force is that data is still being generated at an increasing speed and is still needed at all levels of the organization in order to fuel the innovation and to remain at the edge. So the risk here is obviously that the regulations stop these innovation efforts, and this is exactly what we set ourselves to solve in a way. Is there was a lack of solutions that achieve data protection without dramatically hurting the agility of data projects. I had colleagues working on VPN systems and having headaches at the end of the day because the systems were so constraining that at the end the projects were slowed down and the daily work was dramatically hurt.
Yeah, I think you bring up some really excellent points. And I think for those that are managing the data privacy aspect for large companies, I think they have a pretty good feel for what you're referring to. But for the listeners that are less familiar, I think there is really a daunting responsibility on the part of not only the front-facing business, whether it's a credit card or a technology company or just a regular enterprise in some fashion, but the fact that they have to be able to not only properly get the double opt-ins and properly get the right permissioning and the right storage, but then as it starts to travel through its ecosystem, whether it's just partners or maybe through API hooks, in effect, with or without knowingly, data brokers and other intermediaries that can end up having some form or fashion of that data, including derivative data, and being able to actually trace and have accountability and reporting on that. It's a very exhaustive type of a regulatory framework. It really is. And at the same time, you got this dichotomy like you're talking about, where we're getting so much data, whether it's IoT, whether it's from vehicles, whether it's from the environment, and then, of course, internally generated things, especially because now we're getting into 5G context, and we're storing so much into the cloud, including being able to run these massive computation models for machine learning and deep learning models, for instance. Talk about what your company Statice is doing specifically around the use of synthetic data to help companies be able to still conduct their data analysis, but still being able to comply with the privacy regulations.
You may also like our quarterly Astor Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit astorperkins.com/events.
Statice is exactly this, trying to bridge those two dimensions, complying with the regulations, respecting the privacy of the users, and at the same time being able to conduct data projects and extract the value from the data. So what we built Statice on, and maybe here we're touching on some other points, is this promise or this aim to decouple the learnings, the patterns, the interesting insights from the sensitive identifying information. This was the key idea, is to our very first experiment was to allow data scientists to develop their algorithms on sensitive data without actually accessing the data by moving the algorithms to the data. But then we soon realized that data was the interface that all the data people actually were using. So for them, they still needed to have some useful data first to work with, in order to develop whatever they were developing, algorithms, data analytics, and so on. And this is when we started working with synthetic data, and we shifted to synthetic data exclusively, which had this promise in between, which is synthetic data is data, right? So it's not some different form or intermediate or proxy, and it reduces the risk, because you don't get access to the real data. Actually, with other privacy enhancing technologies, such as homomorphic encryption, federated learning, and so on, we now strongly believe that people will only rarely need the real data in order to get the insight, and this is where we believe the future data processing will be.
So I think for the listeners, two things. One is if you could help define homomorphic encryption, which I think we covered in maybe a year or 2 years ago, and then the definition of synthetic data as well.
Yeah, definitely. Let me start then very quickly with homomorphic encryption, because it's not our expertise. But the main idea of homomorphic encryption is that you can do certain operations. So if you want to compute certain operations on your data, you want to know how a sum of certain things, you can do it on encrypt data directly without ever de-encrypting this data, and this is extremely powerful. Unfortunately, today it's also in terms of performance still not a viable option in all of the use cases, but it's extremely promising. Synthetic data, on the other hand, is completely new, artificially created data that at the macroscopic level has almost all of the information contained in the real data. And at the microscopic level, the synthetic data points are not linked on a one-to-one level to the real ones. And this is the interesting part that links synthetic data to anonymization and data protection, because there's no one-to-one link and no direct mapping. You cannot go back from the synthetic data to the real data. So the process that creates the synthetic data here is irreversible, and it's this irreversibility that makes it useful in the context of anonymization and privacy preservation. This is also the core difference between synthetic data and other more basic data protection approaches, where you just scrap the first names or last names or phone numbers, such as pseudonymization or masking or the likes. Now, it's not because there's no real or no one-to-one direct mapping between the original and the synthetic that you can't extract real information from the synthetic data. On the opposite, what you extract is the general behavior and the general patterns, and much less the individual specificities of the individuals in the original data.
So let's explore that a little bit. So in other words, are we saying that we're taking essentially originally, from the original raw data source, we're taking inspiration from it? And if so, the synthetic data, how does it know the kind of the bounds, the boundaries, parameters to know that it mirrors the original source, and or that you're running a layer of machine learning on top of it to look for those patterns, and based on those patterns, then afterwards extrapolating out and then essentially generating the synthetic data?
Exactly. So the general idea is that finding this general distribution or general how is the real data behaving is not an easy problem to solve, and there are different ways. And the more complex the data, like the more dimensions you have, the more complexities, the more relationships, the harder this task gets. Just an example, if you are purely considering that a person is determined by its their height and weight, well, you can simply estimate those with a simple statistic estimation, and say there's the mean and a variance, and you just have two parameters that define the whole population. But the more parameters you add to characterize the real information, the more complex it gets to produce a generalization of the real data that you can then generate synthetic data from. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are limits to what you can do with synthetic data, especially when you do not know, when you are interested in the specificities of outlying groups of individuals, if the data you're looking at is personal data. These are, if in the context of healthcare, that would be rare disease research. If you only have 10 people in a 1 million people data set, then this information is more likely to be lost. This is also a side effect that, in the context of anonymization and privacy preservation, is desirable. And yeah, all right. I think I got it wrong.
So I think going back to this notion of essentially more data types, more tables, more more columns, and then the relationships in terms of correlation, covariance, confidence, R square. I mean, all the different statistics that comes into the picture, it becomes very highly difficult to model properly. And then the other point that you mentioned is, if you're taking a small sample size, let's say like a 10, and trying to extrapolate out to a population of 1 million people that have diabetes, and that can also have some challenges as well. So I want to preserve some of the limitations for just a second, but this notion is that if we have a general reasonable characterization of what the data is like, that informs a system to start to essentially create this synthetic data in a way that would effectively fit statistically well into that model. Is that correct?
Exactly. That is exactly the idea. Today we use models, deep learning models. Actually, not just one model, but collections of models for different cases that have this ability to learn the relationships to a very high precision and level of utility. So once you generate the synthetic data and you apply your daily tasks, so maybe you had already some machine learning models and you try to learn them on the synthetic data, what you see is that the information is preserved in this after the transformation, which is generation of synthetic data.
I want to explore one piece and then we'll get into the limitation side a little bit, is in the case of just general machine learning, but let's take something more specific around autonomous vehicles. So as companies are looking to, get certification towards level 4, level 5 specifically, the issue that they have is even if they drove these fleets of cars around the world several times over, it's still not enough. It's still not sufficient enough. And that's really where you need to start to create artificial data sets. Moreover, I think driving, as an example, doesn't necessarily unsurface all the possible edge cases or, kind of the outliers, but nonetheless, it still exists in reality. Right. So the fact that you have a cliff on the left side and the right side, and by the way, it's an icy road condition and it's hailing and it's also foggy, whatever it may be. So talk to us about how some of this data is being used, not only from a privacy perspective, but to allow for the volume of data for training purposes, as well as to handle some of these kind of unusual cases.
Don't forget to visit astorperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Julianne Hough, actress, dancer, and winner of Dancing with the Stars; Damian Vaughn, former NFL player; Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astorperkins.com and click on Events.
Synthetic data could also be used to when the real data is simply non-existent or non-measurable. You mentioned the scenarios of self-driving cars. There are some scenarios that are simply impossible to get. If you're trying to simulate a road accident, you'd rather simulate that in a computer system than in the real life, right? And if you don't have these scenarios in your training set, then your self-driving algorithms will not react in the right way when the situation will happen. So we see synthetic data used also as an augmentation of the real data when in situations where you're trying to balance, for instance, your data. You're looking at in the finance sector, you're looking at fraud, and you want to get more fraud cases because you know that you don't have too many of these cases, and then your algorithms are suffering because you don't have them. So you're trying to simulate data that looks like fraud, or at least it doesn't look like your normal data, so that your algorithms will learn better. There's other applications around bias correction. If there are some situations in the real data that contain bias information, and you want your algorithms not to be biased, because you will only be sustaining this vicious circle. Synthetic data in this case will allow you to balance it and even cut some relationships in the data. Maybe you don't want to have relationship between the gender and the pay. You could have synthetic data that respects this constraints and does not include and encode this bias that unfortunately exists in the real data, but you don't want to have it in your algorithm. So these are all applications that go beyond privacy preservation and more into better and more responsible data processing as a whole.
Yeah, and the last point that you were making is so important for a number of reasons because of real life decisions that are being made that affects people. So let's take an example of credit scores or people's decline of, let's say, home loans or credit card or whatever it is, different kinds of loan, because of the fact that they are of, let's say, in the case of Europe, let's say African descent or Middle Eastern descent or Southeastern descent, for example. In the US, it could be African Americans or Hispanic and so forth. So really tuning for some of those things out so that you're not automatically declining them because there's that biasness in the original data set, which you're accounting for it. In the time that we have, let's explore a little bit more in terms of limitations with synthetic data. We start to cover these notions of more the kind of the outlier pockets where it maybe has some issues, as well as the ability to have that statistical strength in terms of extrapolation if the data set that you're working with is kind of small to begin with.
Exactly. In the case of small amounts of data is interesting, especially in healthcare, where most clinical studies concern tens, maybe hundreds of people, and in this case, it is very difficult to generalize and create more data out of this so that we can learn from it. One interesting point here that we didn't touch on is that on the other hand, you have all these new health tech companies that are sitting on large amounts of data, but sometimes do not have the know-how and knowledge to dig into that data. And in these cases, the privacy preservation part of synthetic data allows to open up to the researchers so that they tap into a large amount of data. So this is a way of short-circuiting the small data of the healthcare. In terms of difficulties with increasing data complexity, we also see this if you look at data that's sitting in different places within an organization, or sometimes sitting at different organizations, but concerning the same people. These are cases that are typically not possible to tackle with synthetic data, and these are cases where other technologies would be a better fit. Things like federated learning, where you share the learning, so you move the learning from one place to the other, and you keep the data where it is without moving it. So these are all ways or techniques that are more suitable to these situations than synthetic data.
I appreciate that, and I think that's really so important. Is I think for those listeners, especially those that are in decision-making capacity at enterprises, is really what we're talking about. It's a toolbox, and it's one of many tools that we need to consider thoughtfully. For the time that we have, can you share a lesson learned, whether it's a product or project failure, and any insights that you've gained that you can share with others?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that we learned very quickly was we had this aim and goal to make working with data more privacy preserving, and we started with a completely different direction. The first advice is to start experimenting as early as possible. In our case, it was during a hackathon with a health tech app here in Berlin, where people started we experimented with the idea of moving the algorithms from data scientists to the data, but we could see that the people were not reacting at all. And we were like, okay, but give us some data to work with. And the solution at the time was to give them random data, which actually many organizations still do. Random data is absolutely not useful for data science. This is what they produce with. This is not very helpful. So experimenting as early as possible, getting user feedback as early as possible is crucial. Remaining flexible and open also to what's happening around you, and reacting and anticipating these changes is also extremely crucial to be able to survive and thrive.
So thank you so much for your insights and the valuable experience that you can share with others there. So I've been joined by Omar Ali Fdal, who is the CEO of Statice. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Scott, for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.